Tonight I'm going to talk about the history of sharks. It's kind of my more academic lecture than a popular public lecture, so there's a little bit of terminology and stuff in it, but it's not too complex. So I've given this same talk many times. Recently, I just came back from a month's tour in England, where we were giving talks about the same book and promoting the UK edition that just came out. So sharks go back a long way with me personally. I grew up as a kid in Melbourne, and as a hobby, I used to collect fossil shark's teeth. And this is one I found when I was about 8 or 9 years of age from Beaumaris, so back in the 1960s. And I built up a big collection of fossil shark's teeth and entered the State of Victoria Science Talent Search and actually won a prize for, doing descriptions and drawings of shark's teeth. But my career has been about the evolution of fish. And for many, many years, I worked on fossil fishes from Victoria, from Mount Howard, the high country around Mansfield. I did my PhD up there. And then eventually I got hooked on a site called Gogo in the Kimberley near Fitzroy Crossing, where you get three-dimensional, perfect, uncrushed fossils that recently we've discovered three-dimensional organs in them, the oldest heart in the world, muscles preserved, livers, stomachs, etc. We've had 7 or 8 Nature and Science papers just on those discoveries alone, including the origin of the earliest vertebrate reproductive structures. So, although most of my career has been looking at these ancient early fishes, I have spent a bit of time looking at sharks. And so I'm really proud of this new book that's just come out, which gives you, for the first time ever, the complete history of sharks over nearly 500 million years. So that's what this lecture is about. How do we change the... It's not working.
That's great.
Oh, there we go. Great. Thank you.
Down or across or...
Okay. So one of the take-home messages about the history of sharks is they're great survivors. In the last 500 million years, Earth has gone through 5 mass extinction events that each time nearly wiped out the vast majority of life on the planet. And sharks are the only group of jawed animals on the planet to have survived all 5 of those mass extinction events. How did they do it? That's one of the questions we'll talk about tonight. Let's first of all talk about what sharks are. Well, clearly everyone knows they're fishes. They differ from the vast majority of fishes because they don't have a bony skeleton. They have a cartilaginous skeleton. But it's not the kind of cartilage that you and I have in our nose or our ears or our hip joints. They have a unique kind of cartilage that evolved specifically for strength and lightness of frame. It's called globular calcified cartilage. And so the cartilage has layers of tesserae tiles, and it gives a great amount of flexibility, but also strength. And for the really big sharks that have powerful bites, like white sharks and some of the extinct forms, the calcification of the vertebrae and the cartilage parts gives it even more strength. So they can be almost as hard as bone, some of these shark cartilages. Unlike normal fish that have large overlapping scales, sharks have a shagreen of very tiny placoid scales set in the skin. So when you look at a shark, you can't actually see the scales. They're that small. They're, under the size of a pinhead. But they're made of the same tissues as teeth. They have like dentine with enameloids over the top and a bony base and a pulp cavity in some cases that indicates that they're very much like teeth and they're connected to the origin of teeth as well. And this is about as scientific as the whole talk really gets. Just in terms of actual classification of sharks, they're called the Chondrichthyans, right? The cartilaginous fishes, as opposed to the bony fishes. Today in our oceans, we've got something like 30,000 species of bony fishes, things like the marlin, snapper, flathead, trout, whatever, and rivers and oceans. But the Chondrichthyans include the true sharks and the rays, which diverged from a common ancestor about 200 million years ago in the Jurassic period. But there's an even earlier time of divergence with the rat fishes or holocephalans, which diverged about 380 million years in the Devonian. So today we've got about 1,200 species of Chondrichthyans, about 50 species of the holocephalans, about 550 species of sharks, and about 600 or more species of rays. But there's more. They're just the living groups of sharks and rays. The very first members of this group appeared about 470 million years ago. And they represent the stem group of Chondrichthyans from which the modern group arose. And they have a lot more bone in their skeleton, a lot more spines, and some very weird body shapes, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the oldest sharks, like fishes we know of, are these scales that come from Central Australia. I've actually been to the site. It's near Alice Springs. And we have nothing else but individual isolated scales of a shark that's been named as Tantalepus because it's so tantalizing that all we have are the scales, nothing else. But the scales are so similar to those placoid scales of living sharks that they can't be related to the bony fishes. They have to be on that line to sharks. As you'll see from the other diagrams, we've got slightly more complex forms evolving later in what's called the Ordovician period, where they get a lot more complex in terms of the morphology. And eventually we get a whole bunch of complex histologies developing before the end of this Ordovician period of different kinds of scales. We even think that, oh, it's meant to be a disappearing animation here. This one here, there we go. We even think they may have evolved from certain fishes that were jawless called thelodonts, because they have scales that are very, very similar to the structure of early shark scales. They only differ by one feature, that the sharks tend to have neck canals in these scales, but they all have a bony base, a dentine crown, and a pulp cavity going through it. Again, structures very similar to teeth. The end of Ordovician period, about 443, 45 million years ago, was the first of these 5 mass extinction events. There was a major crash in the oceans in terms of oxygen and also trace elements like selenium, which I documented in one of my papers here back in 2016. And we think that the only way sharks survived this particular mass extinction event, which devastated life in our oceans, was because some of these forms were existing in deep water. The shallow waters, the shallow seaways got absolutely hammered by anoxia and lack of trace elements that wiped out most, or 70%, 75% of all life in the oceans. But sharks got through. So from the handful of forms below that line, from the Ordovician into the Silurian, we start getting a rich diversity of sharks. But again, they're only known from scales or spines. We don't have any teeth. We don't have any whole bodies or skeletons from that period, until very recently, something turned up from China. So we have these isolated tooth whorls that come from an early shark called Chondrichthyans from the early Silurian of China, about 438 million years ago. And we have bits of bone that belong to the fin spines of these very spiny early sharks called Fanginchania. And we have better preserved elements of these whole complete fish from the Silurian and Devonian of other parts of North America and Asia and Europe. The earliest thing that's closest to the modern shark lineage, though, is a thing called Shanacanthus. It was about 3 to 4 centimeters long, fully grown. It was tiny. And these are the first shark-like fishes in the whole world where we have a whole type of body preserved. But that's all we know about them. We can't find if they've got teeth. We can't identify their scales because they're kind of impressions in the rock that are studied from latex peels of where the original bone was but is now gone. So again, very tantalizing. These discoveries, by the way, were so important scientifically that there were 4 papers back to back in the journal Nature in October 2022 when they were announced. And from one of those papers, we see that this strange array of early primitive fish, we have our placoderms, which are early jawed armored fishes, the first creatures with jaws. And then we have the sharks and the bony fishes diverging about 455 million years ago. And that's a date based on the molecular clock combined with the fossil record. So it's an estimated time of divergence. But the modern shark lineage, what we call the crown Chondrichthyans, didn't appear till much, much later in time, probably around 370 million years ago. So, you know, if they first appeared 465 million years ago, we're looking at like 100 million years of mysterious, nebulous early proto-sharks before we get the beginning of the modern line leading to true sharks. Let's show you some of these early examples of what we think are on the line to true sharks.
There's people waiting online, and I'll just try to
So what we're looking at here are the earliest known true shark's teeth that have a morphology that indicates they were replaced on a regular basis. So one of the things that separates sharks from other fishes is that they have like a construction line of teeth created by the dental lamina. They can produce teeth, so there's always sharp teeth at the biting edge of the mouth. They will shed those teeth and they'll be popped up. A new one will just replace it straight away. A typical shark today can generate 20,000 teeth in a lifetime. And when those teeth are shed, they go straight to the bottom of the sea, and they're often preserved as fossils. So that's why sharks' teeth make excellent fossils. This thing's called Leonodus that lived about 415 million years ago, and its remains come from Spain, from the Leon area. There are other early fossil sharks appearing that kind of are intermediates between true sharks and, say, other kinds of fishes, like these early experiments from Africa and South America, where we have the same kind of globular calcified cartilage that you can see clearly from the impressions in these rocks, but they have teeth ankylosed to the jaw. They don't have rows of individual teeth. So they're kind of experimental sharks that haven't quite developed the replacement teeth. Then we have these early forms that have complex teeth with many crowns on the base, and they include forms like this from Central Australia and also the Mansfield region. I named this new one only in 2021 after John Maisie. We call it Otodus. The teeth are very similar to a bramble shark, Echinorinus. They have multiple cusps on each root, and each of those cusps are actually serrated like a steak knife. It's the earliest evidence of sharks with serrated teeth. And most of these early sharks were tiny. The teeth were small. But from material I found in Antarctica, we find the first really gigantic or big sharks occurring maybe up to 3 or 4 meters in length, because the teeth get up to 20, 25 millimeters in height. So I've had 4 expeditions collecting fossils in Antarctica. I think the most exciting thing we found there was a whole bunch of new sharks that represented not only the first diversification of large sharks anywhere on the planet, but also the fact that they were invading freshwater environments. They were found in river and lake environments, so they were not in marine deposits. If you look at any textbook on sharks and look for the Devonian period, the age of fishes, where fishes were the dominant vertebrates on the planet, and it's at the end of the Devonian we start getting the first amphibians invading land and the first forests invading the continents. We find that most of the sharks look a lot like this fellow called Cladosalake, which just looks like a typical shark. There's a well-preserved one that has the muscles preserved. They found in North America, in Ohio and New York State. And they lived right at the end of the Devonian about 357 million years ago. But guess what? They're not sharks. They were described by this guy called Bashford Dean, who, throughout my book, by the way, I tell the personal stories of all these amazing scientists who describe these early sharks. Some of them were the most incredible Renaissance kind of people you can imagine. This guy held 3 academic positions at the same time in the 1920s. He was a professor at Columbia University. He was curator in reptiles and fishes at the American Museum of Natural History. And he was an art curator at the Met, armor and medieval armaments. Bashford Dean, a wonderful guy, did incredible work on early sharks. His greatest life achievement was building this huge gallery of the evolution of fishes at the American Museum, but unfortunately it died the day before it opened. Anyway, back to sharks. So we have some amazing new discoveries coming out of Morocco of whole complete sharks from the Devonian period, about 365 million years ago or so. And some of these now, instead of just studying them in a rock by preparing them with drills and looking at them under a magnifying glass or a microscope, we now put the whole thing through CT scans, and we can make 3-dimensional models, virtual models of their skull and brain case, and actually make movies of how they move their jaws and how their gill arches work. So it's a whole new ball game, and we're discovering that these are all like the one I showed you before, Cladosalake. They're not on the line to modern sharks. They're all on the line going to holocephalans or ratfish, right? So there's this early diversification. Common ancestor they diversified from was a shark-like fish, but then they diverged in morphology and eventually became more like the holocephalans. And there's a whole lot of these sharks from the Devonian that aren't real sharks, but are stem holocephalans. Here's another one recently described that had a flat, wide head with very wide olfactory organs. It's like a shark trying to be, like an early holocephalan trying to be a hammerhead shark, if you like. I discovered a shark up at Gogo in the Kimberley, which I'd been working this site since 1986 and made many discoveries of armored fishes and early bony fishes, but no one had ever found a shark there until 2005. And this is a picture of me a couple of minutes after hitting this rock, and it split, and you can see these two jaw-like structures there. When the rock is then put in weak acetic acid, we dissolve the rock and we get the cartilage out in 3D. So they're the two sides of the lower jaw, actually, that have been prepared out of the rock. But the most interesting thing about this find is when we looked at the histology of the cartilage, both with CT scanning and also thin sectioning, our histology expert, who was an author on the paper, indicated that it actually had remnant bone cells, osteocytes, between the layers of cartilage. So it's kind of like the smoking gun, showing that earlier sharks had lots of bone in their skeleton, and eventually as the cartilage evolved, there was less bone until they were just entirely 100% cartilage. But this represents the last shark that's the ancestor to all modern sharks, rays, and holocephalans. So the sister group to all the living shark group, if you like. This is what a typical true shark on the line to modern sharks looks like from the Devonian. Complex teeth, many cusps, and because the teeth are complex, every known shark, whether it be alive today or extinct, can be identified down to species level just from its teeth alone. They're that distinctive. So this one is known from a complete specimen with the liver, impressions of muscles, the jaws, and it was very eel-like. So great diversity happening early on in the beginning of modern sharks. This is a stem Salacian on the true road to sharks. Sharks didn't have it easy in the Devonian period because they weren't the top dogs of the oceans. There were big armored fishes around called placoderms. Anyone here in the audience ever heard of placoderms? Anyone apart from Heather? Good, good. People know about placoderms. That's wonderful. So we have these beautiful three-dimensional placoderms from the Gogo site. And we recently published a primer about placoderms in Current Biology, if you want to know, a basic introduction to them. But they basically evolved well before sharks. So they took over most of the niches in both the oceans, the rivers, and the lakes. So when sharks finally got into these areas, they had very little ecological niches to go into. And that's why they didn't really diversify much in the Devonian period until these placoderms went extinct. By the end of the Devonian, right at the very end, this is about 359 million years ago, we're getting the remains of some truly gigantic sharks for the very first time. This is unpublished work, by the way. It's from my colleagues in Switzerland that have been collecting in Morocco. These are gigantic jaws up to 70 centimeters long of a very big shark, maybe 6 to 7 meters long, called Tenacanthus, that's just been discovered in Morocco. So there were some big sharks that were actually bigger than the placoderms. And right at the end of the Devonian, we get the first time in the history of sharks, they become more abundant than any of the other fish groups in the ocean. So they're just starting to get there. But then another mass extinction event happened, the end Devonian extinction event, in 2 big pulses over 4 periods of biotic crisis. Again, massive anoxia, sea levels dropped, trace elements dropped, and basically everything living in shallow water marine environments got hammered. Sharks just sail through that without any noticeable extinctions whatsoever. Yep.
What do you think the cause was for those extinctions?
Well,
meteors or volcanoes or?
There was talk of one meteor impact in Sweden, the Salajan impact, but it's mostly, they think, just dramatic changes in sea level caused by changes in temperature. I think I explain it more in the book. There's quite a lot of detail there. So shark evolution, just to summarize so far, from the Ordovician, from the first appearance of these scales, we have just a handful of specimens that are well known. But then when we get into the end of the Devonian, most of the sharks in that yellow box there They're all forms going onto the line to holocephalans. In the blue box, we have the ones going to the true sharks or elasmobranchs today, and we just have a handful of species there. At the end of the Devonian, the Carboniferous period ensued, and this was the coal-bearing age. Lots of coal deposits formed in shallow lakes and river systems around the world. But it's the first time sharks actually reach a peak of diversity where they greatly outnumber all the other fishes in our oceans. They are the dominant fish in the seas for the first, and dare I say, the only time in their history. We have some spectacular forms here, very bizarre looking forms. Everything you see in this picture on the right is a shark or a shark-like fish, either a shark or a holocephalan on the line to ratfish, including these strange forms with dorsal fins like anvils and others with strange pectoral fins coming out of their neck that could fly through the water like marine butterflies. But one of the best fossils of this age in the world is this pair of falcatus, early sharks that were caught in the act either just before mating. The male below with this big dorsal fin spine, the female is biting that dorsal fin spine. We know it's a male because it has claspers off the pectoral fins, which are for reproduction. The female lacks those structures. So this particular site in Montana has preserved over 80 species of sharks in the one fossil site, and they were all buried rapidly by huge influxes of sediment after storms and monsoons. It's kind of swept out in big currents to the bay and then sank as flows that buried the fish. There's got an incredible diversity of sharks from this one site. Thanks to my good colleague up here on the right, unfortunately my picture's blocking his face, Professor Dick Lund from Adelphi University, who spent 50 field seasons in a row going back to this same site and digging with teams of volunteers. But look at some of these sharks. They're just, you wouldn't recognize them as sharks or holocephalans today. Some of them have big pectoral fins, almost trying to become a stingray. There are others that look almost like modern ratfishes and chimerids, but many bizarre and unusual forms. Half of them that he's found still haven't been described yet in the literature. I think one of the most spectacular Carboniferous sharks, though, has to be the Bear's Den shark from Scotland. The town of Bear's Den, just out of Glasgow, was a site where one of my good friends that I knew when he was alive, Stan Wood, would go and collect fossils from that area. He was an amateur fossil collector and eventually became a well-known fossil dealer that sold to the museums and different institutions around the world. But he discovered this shark, it's about 1 metre long, from just taking his dog for a walk through the local park near Glasgow. And eventually he dug it out and he got not only this shark, but many sharks and many other superb fossils. It's called Acmenistian, and it looked like this. So when I was writing my book, I actually commissioned an artist to do 15 new reconstructions of these ancient fishes. So this is the latest new reconstruction of this, what this shark looked like. The structure on the back was probably, we don't know why, for stability, or it could have been a sexual dimorphism thing between males and females. We really don't know. But whatever it was very successful because the bellies of these sharks are full of little shrimp. So we know they were good, fast predators. There's a picture here of Stan Wood. He passed away in 2012, but he was one of the greatest fossil collectors of all time. He discovered something like over 20 new species that are new to science that were in the Royal Scottish Museum, including early tetrapods, early reptiles. Prior to this find that we made in Victoria that was announced in Nature last week, he had the oldest reptiles known from the British area from Great Britain, found in Scotland, a thing called Westlothiania that he found and described. He didn't describe it, but he sold it to the British Museum and they described it. Carboniferous rocks around Edinburgh, around the beaches there, you can find these amazing nodules of ironstone. And in the old days, you'd hit them with a hammer and you'd see a mess of stuff and you wouldn't know what it was. But the modern way of doing it is to stick them straight into a CT scanner or a synchrotron and get these amazing 3D images of the skull and brain case. And again, this is teaching us huge advances on the anatomy of these early sharks, which I won't go into because it's very complex, but we have the whole brain structure, the inner ears preserved, and we can see the ability they had for moving their jaws in strange ways that modern sharks can't. Like, for example, this one here, Tristichius, when it opened its lower jaw, the jaws rolled out and it could have all the teeth sticking out like hooks to jig squid rather than just having mouths that open up and down. So they had all sorts of peculiar abilities to do that with a loose symphysis. And that's what it looked like. And this is actually looking like, for the first time, something like a modern shark, a little bit like a Port Jackson shark. It's got the twin dorsal fin spines there. And it is indeed on the lineage to modern sharks. The first of the really big sharks I showed you before from Morocco, these group called the tenacants, actually radiated into many different forms and were the largest sharks of the Carboniferous period. Some of these teeth are the size of your hand. They're really gigantic, called Otodus, maybe 8 meters in length. But there were so many weird sharks and shark-like fishes in the Carboniferous period that it's hard to get a handle on just how weird they were. Individual rows of teeth like this from the lower jaw, that's millimeter scale, individual single giant teeth of sharks that had 3 or 4 teeth in their jaw only, but could use them to break up clams and hard-shelled creatures, and teeth like this with multiple roots, but a flat sort of blade on the tooth. Very strange. But to me, it's really interesting when you look at the tooth plates on the top belong to a shark, and yet the ones below it, which are almost identical, belong to a lungfish. So these marine lungfishes went extinct at the end of the Devonian, and after that, they only lived in freshwater environments. And immediately when they go extinct, shark-like forms come in with the same type of morphology of crushing tooth plates and take that niche over. So sharks were just occupying all the niches you could imagine at that time. It's a really interesting time to be a shark. One shark even had this big, long, flat snout. Now, I should have mentioned it sooner, but this is really my prompt to say this. But sharks and rays today are all electroreceptive. They all have ampullae of Lorenzi around their head, which means they can detect the electric fields of living creatures. This is really handy. It explains why hammerheads have big, wide hammers, and bonnethead sharks are virtually like minesweepers. They can sweep along the bottom of the sea. There can be a fish or a crab buried in the sand. They can detect the electric field, dig it up, and eat it. So having a morphology of a snout like this, which is flat, not pointed for streamlining, indicates that this shark was definitely using its electroreceptive snout to find prey. And so this is the first evidence we have of sharks actually developing structures for electroreception in the fossil record. At this time, we have a great invasion of all the rivers and lakes of the world by one group of sharks called the xenocants. They're very strange sharks. They were usually about 3 to 4 meters in length, very large spines coming out the back of their neck. We don't know what they were for. They were the biggest predators in the system, so it probably wasn't for protection, but it might have been, I don't know, some sort of sexual display for males and females. We don't know. Some of them have the spines, some of them don't. But the xenocants actually ruled the coal swamps of that era. They're very commonly known as fossils because wherever there are coal mines in Europe or North America, they find these things. So their skeletons get dug up. The one on the bottom left is a classic example in coal-bearing rocks, the white skeleton from Germany. They're also the earliest evidence of cannibalism, where we have their own species eating each other, or xenocants eating other types of xenocant. The very last member of this group died out here in Australia from the Sydney Basin in the Upper Triassic about 230 million years ago. But before we leave the Paleozoic era, I must draw your attention to the most bizarre and interesting shark of all time, in my opinion, my favorite ancient shark, Helicoprion, or the buzzsaw shark. Imagine finding these ancient whorls of teeth. Now, this is nearly 2/3 of a meter across. It's a whorl of teeth, hundreds of teeth on the one jaw, and each of those teeth can be up to 7 or 8 centimeters high, and they have serrated edges, but just a single row of them. This Russian geologist, Alexander Karpinsky, and he's one of the great human stories in this book. He was one of the greatest geologists of Russia back in the late 1800s. He single-handedly with his team, he was the boss that organized teams to go out and map and make the first geological maps of all of Russia. He became fascinated with the paleontology of the area of the Perm Mountains, and he started finding these tooth whorls. but had no idea what they belonged to. We couldn't just say they were sharks, but he studied them intensely and eventually found impressions of cartilage. So he said, yeah, they must be sharks because they've got a cartilage base to these teeth. But he didn't know how they fitted onto the shark. So his early reconstructions had them as giant curly noses coming off the front of the snout that they would have struck their prey down like some bizarre marine elephant with these sharp teeth. Later on, before his very last sort of papers, he came around to thinking they were part of the lower jaw. He's a very interesting character because when the Bolshevik Revolution came in 1917 and he was friends with the Tsar, he thought he was going to be put up against a wall and shot. But the people chose him to lead Russia into a new period of science. He became the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's the only paleontologist to be buried in the Acropolis wall to this day. So what did this thing do? We now know that the lower jaws were bearing this huge wall of teeth, and they could only work in one plane of axis. Now, that's hard to imagine if you've just got a static jaw, but this thing actually had an ability to sort of move this jaw back in such a way that it could, we believe, snap the body out of a coily ammonite that had a fleshy squid-like thing in the middle. Not snap the shell in half because there's no wear on any of these teeth. So the other alternative explanation is they were eating squid, very large squid, and these were like the perfect jaws to sort of jig squid on and catch them. These things grew to about 8 meters to 10 meters in length. They were the first truly gigantic shark since the tenacants, and the last really big shark until you get to megalodon, which I'll tell you about later in the same talk. The very first remains of this shark, by the way, come from Australia, from Western Australia, where they were found in the early 1880s before Karpinski described his material from Russia. Now, the end of the Permian period, 252 million years ago, is often referred to as the Great Dying. It was the biggest, most severest of all mass extinction events of all time. Scientists estimate between 81 to 96% of all species went extinct in marine habitats at that time. It was caused by massive volcanic eruptions this time, where the Siberian traps released up to 12,000 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere, causing euxinia, which is hydrogen sulfide-rich seawaters, high temperatures, acidic oceans, and an accelerated form of global warming, basically. Now, this time, many groups of sharks did go extinct. All those bizarre early forms with the strange teeth, they didn't make it through. But the Salacian sharks, the ones on the line to modern sharks, all of those groups made it through. Why? We think they had a much wider range of habitats, including deep sea open oceans, because we find their teeth in the remains of deep sea deposits. There was a consequence. Sharks didn't get through easily from that big mass extinction event. For 140 million years after that extinction event, all sharks in the oceans were mostly tiny, mostly under a meter. There were 1 or 2 exceptions that got to 2 to 3 meters, but the vast majority of them belonged to this little group called the hybodonts, which were small sharks that had one special adaptation that we didn't see in previous sharks up until this point. They had Swiss Army knife type dentitions. Instead of just having one kind of tooth for one kind of diet, they could have sharp pointed teeth at the front, crushing teeth at the back, different shaped teeth in the middle. You know, see those 2 teeth there? You can get the same kinds of tooth morphologies on the same jaw of one species. So it's being an opportunist, being small, so you need less resources, and having a wider range of diet that got these sharks not only through that extinction event, but they flourished then, and there are up to 30 different species of them by the Jurassic. Another great character in the book is Arthur Smith Woodward, worked at the British Museum of Natural History for 40 years, only ever took half a day off in that 40 years because he broke his arm. This guy was a machine. He wrote over 750 scientific papers, described 300 types of new sharks and fish. He wrote his first paper at the age of 14 and his last scientific paper 4 years after his death. They say he was still writing in his coffin. But he wrote these large compendiums of the fossil fishes in the British Museum with annotated notes on them that are still the starting point for any serious research today. Incredible guy. I mean, in each of the chapters of the book, I feature these hero scientists from different periods and tell their life story, because I think it's important to tell the story of people as well as the sharks that brought these discoveries to our attention. And of course, we can't leave out Mary Anning. She was a very famous fossil hunter from the Lyme Regis area. I gave a talk on sharks, this same talk at Lyme Regis about 2 months ago, actually. And we had a very good audience attending. And I had all these curators there from the museum. And I said, I bet you I can tell you something about Mary Anning you do not know. And they said, what? I said, well, everyone thought that Mary Anning was just a collector of fossils that prepared them and sold them to the museums and so on. But did you know she published a peer-reviewed, single-authored scientific paper? They said, no, we didn't know that. Well, she did, and it was on this shark, Otodus. And so she published an observations on the anatomy of Otodus as her only scientific publication. And I think that qualifies her to be called a paleontologist, not just a fossil collector. So she made huge contributions to paleontology through the finds she made. She's had fossil sharks and marine reptiles named after her in her honor by all the great scientists of the day. And she truly deserves to be praised for the life work that she did. So now we're getting into the Jurassic period. And the Jurassic, about 183 million years ago, we have a minor extinction event. It's not a mass extinction event because you've got to have more than 75% of species going extinct to qualify as a mass extinction event. But we had a minor extinction event caused by anoxia or lack of oxygen in some of these ocean basins. 2 pulses causing icehouse events that then turn to sudden warming. And what we have here is a whole range of new sharks just appearing all at once after this event about 183 million years ago. And the groups that take off at this time are called Neocoelacanths, and they are the modern sharks. The modern group that all sharks today belong to are called Neocoelacanths. Now, what defines a Neocoelacanth, you might ask? And this is the work of Charlie Underwood from Birkbeck College. The Neocoelacanths have a new histology they've evolved for their teeth. So up until now, every shark we've looked at didn't have very many layers of enameloid on the teeth. We humans have enamel over the dentine of our teeth. Enamel is very well organized crystallites that are very well bundled and parallel. But when the bundles of enamel of crystallites are all over the place, it's called enameloid because it's not a true enamel. Early sharks have 1 or 2 layers of enameloid, but the Neocoelacanths are the first group to have 3 separate layers of this strong enameloid, which means the tooth is stronger, it's more resilient, it doesn't break so easily, and it's more effective. So we know most of these early Neocoelacanths just by the morphology of these teeth, but we have some whole complete ones preserved, like this really strange one from Italy called Ostinocoelacanth, which had the same structure of the fin in terms of the tail and the anal fin as fishes that live in South America today called gymnotiforms. And they're capable of generating electric shocks in the water to stun their prey. So it's been postulated that this was the only shark that could generate electric pulses. We do know of rays, of course, can do that, electric rays, but this was a shark well before the rays evolved. That's by Chris Duffin. The end Triassic was another smaller extinction event caused again by volcanic eruptions like the Great Dying, massively high greenhouse emissions, high levels of marine extinctions. Many of the marine reptiles that had invaded the seas went extinct apart from 2 main groups, the ichthyosaurs, the dolphin-like marine reptiles, and the plesiosaurs with their long necks. A few groups of sharks die out, but mostly the hybridonts and these basic Neocoelacanths carry on through. We have probably the best preserved, most beautiful fossil sharks from this period from Germany, a place called Sollenhofen, which is where the earliest bird, Archaeopteryx, comes from with the feathers preserved. So it was an ancient reef, an archipelago, lots of islands, tropical, marine sediments are very sticky with lots of calcareous mud. Things died and got stuck in this mud and got buried and got well preserved. This is the first time we're getting modern sharks appearing in the fossil record. When I say modern sharks, sharks like this Port Jackson shark below the same genus, Heterodontus, looking identical to the living Port Jackson sharks, only minor differences in the dentitions, alongside a whole bunch of other strange late archaic forms that are still hanging on, like Protospinax up there. But by the Jurassic, the end of the Jurassic, we have all the major groups in terms of the classification of living sharks appearing. Things like angel sharks or lamniforms, which are going to give rise to things like our great white sharks. Things like wobbegongs or exolobiforms. So without going too much into the classification of sharks, we can say that all the major groups of sharks that are around today had appeared by either the late Jurassic or the very early part of the next period, the Cretaceous. Most importantly, the rays appear at this time. The great split between rays and sharks happened at this time, and we have intermediate forms like we have alive today, the guitar sharks with broad pectoral fins and long tails. One of the most fascinating things, though, about this split is that the same thing happened on land, where dinosaurs got smaller and got running faster, got feathers with wings, and eventually evolved into birds. So they shifted their locomotion from rear-wheel drive, shall we say, to front-wheel drive using their wings, their pectoral fins and pectoral muscles. Sharks did exactly the same thing, evolving into rays. Instead of pushing themselves along with a powerful tail, they evolved a much larger pectoral fin, which eventually could just undulate or flap. But basically, it was a much more efficient way of moving through the water by flying through the water, not pushing themselves through the water. During the Cretaceous, about 100 million years ago, we start getting big predatory sharks that are related to large predators today, like the white shark, the lamniforms. And my friend Michael Siverson at the West Australian Museum discovered this one back in the late 90s in Cartabia Station. He called it Cartabiodon. It was a really big shark, up to 8 meters in length, but it wasn't related to white sharks. It was related to the grey nurse shark or the sand tiger sharks. There's some truly fantastic fossils of these big predatory sharks in a tiny little museum in northern Italy, north of Verona, and Santa Dana Alfredo Museum. And they have quarries there that quarry the lustame, or the Scalia Rossa, the red limestone that paves the streets of Milan. And you can see, walking Milan, you see these big ammonites in the pavement. They all come from this one quarry. And occasionally they would split rock and find whole complete sharks, sometimes up to 6 meters in length. That's me examining the mouth of one of them that's over 1 meter across. And inside its belly was a complete skeleton of a 2-meter turtle. And we know the shark ate the turtle because the turtle has one of the teeth of the shark stuck in its shell. So it's a fantastic piece of ecological trophic web evidence in the fossil record. They reckon this shark was still only a teenager, maybe 17 years old. And if it kept growing along the same trajectory as living sharks, it may have reached 10 or 11 meters in length. And there's a picture of a whole shark with all of its vertebrae. The teeth are at the other end. It's at 6 meters long, of a shark called Cretoxyrhina. So we have the rise of these big predatory lamniform sharks that look a lot like great whites at about this time. They, of course, didn't have it easy because they had competition from giant marine reptiles called mosasaurs that invaded the seas right at the end of the Cretaceous about 90 million years ago. At first, the mosasaurs was tiny, 4 to 5 meters. And these big sharks at 7, 8, even 9 meters long were the top dogs of the ocean. But that didn't last. Only took a few million years before the mosasaurs grew to gigantic sizes, up to 20 meters in length. And at that time, the sharks actually got smaller. And right towards the end of this period, when the dinosaurs went extinct, the mosasaurs went extinct, and the sharks were really quite small. They were no bigger than living sharks today. We do have some wonderful deposits, and these are just examples of perfectly preserved sharks from Lebanon in the late Cretaceous. We had giant sand tiger sharks that were way bigger than grey nurses today. We had a giant shark with bulbous crushing tooth plates, which we used to think was related to the rays until 2024, just as this book was going to press, and I'd written the other story about this shark. A paper was published showing the whole complete shark, not just the dentition. And it turned out it had a lamniform shaped body like a white shark, but it had a mouthful of crushing teeth. So it showed that these lamniforms were very abundant at this time and they're diversified into many different niches. They think this was an adaptation for feeding on turtles or giant marine squid-like creatures called ammonites. The end Cretaceous, big asteroids struck the world. Dinosaurs went extinct. Those marine reptiles went extinct. Many of the big ammonites in the oceans, they all went extinct. There was a big effect on sharks. About 62% didn't fully recover. Most of those hybridonts and those archaic forms all went extinct. Some new work that hasn't been published yet, but will be published any day now in Current Biology, because I refereed the paper and I know the authors, so it's okay to use this. But we find that the modern diversity of sharks in our oceans today was reached 110 million years ago. And after that, sharks just kept diversifying to reach a peak about 45 million years ago, where they were twice the diversity in the oceans as they are today. And after that, they declined. So that's to the baseline of the species we know have been alive in the last 100 years or so. What's happening today is even worse and more severe, but I'll talk about that at the very end. So after the age of dinosaurs, we have some wonderful periods of warming. In the Eocene, about 48 million years ago, the oceans suddenly warmed and we have great bursts of productivity. We have sharks living on coral reefs for the first time. And we also have whales appearing in our oceans, a source of food for the big predatory sharks. These are beautifully preserved specimens from another site in Italy called Montebolca, that they even have the color preserved on the tips of the fins, the black tips, and absolutely magnificent preservation. At this time, we see a changing of the guard. During the age of dinosaurs, the dominant predatory sharks were the lamniforms, the groups that today we have the white shark, the thresher shark, and the mako sharks, and so on. The carchareniforms, which include the tiger sharks and the bull sharks, requiem, and hammerheads, they were very much a small component during the age of dinosaurs. But after that extinction event, they've become suddenly the most dominant sharks in our oceans. Today, for example, we've got over nearly 300 species of these sharks around in our oceans, but only 15 species of lamniforms left. But in the Cretaceous, there are over 100 different kinds of lamniforms. I just showed this curve, but the point is that the climbing phase for Neocoelacanths or modern sharks reaches this point here in the when the oceans were warming in the Eocene period. And after that, certain groups declined rapidly. Rays especially, see this graph on the right, they declined very rapidly. They reached an even greater peak of diversity as well. This paper will be out very soon, so you can all read it when it comes out. Finally, I'm going to end up with talking about the biggest predator of all time, full stop. Bigger than any dinosaur, megalodon. But before we get to megalodon, this was its ancestor, Otodus obliquus, a shark maybe in the order of 7 or 8 meters in length, known from its teeth from deposits all around the world straight after the extinction of dinosaurs. The beginning of this megatooth lineage, where the teeth go from being like razor sharp to being serrated like this megalodon tooth, can be traced to one particular series of species between 53 and 48 million years ago from the deserts of Kazakhstan. And my friend David Ward made this discovery. It was like, in paleontology, it's like kind of searching for the origin of the Nile in geography. He actually found the beds within a small section of about 5 meters, where you go from one species with no serrations to one with a few serrations to one that's bigger and more coarsely serrated. But the morphology of the tooth doesn't change, only the serrations. And then suddenly they get bigger and bigger as whales take off. There's more prey in the oceans. And these megatooth sharks get bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, we get to megalodon. This is David in his office. A veterinarian who set up a franchise of veterinary surgeries all around Britain. So he made his money that way so he could chase fossil shark's teeth for the rest of his life. Incredible guy. He's still written over 150 scientific papers and 90 new species of fossil sharks. White sharks are the iconic shark alive today. And there's a whole chapter in my book about the history of white sharks. I went diving with them as well, and I'll show you a bit of video in a minute. But they basically evolved from giant mako sharks about 7 million years ago. The thing is, we think they're ancient predators, but they're not. It's quite the opposite. White sharks are the youngest species in our oceans today. They don't go back that far at all. We also had giant thresher sharks, the ones with the big long tails, with serrations. And the point is that serrations have evolved in different lineages of sharks at least a dozen different times. So any shark can go from a species without serrations to a species with serrations quite easily. And that's a genetic thing. There are papers published on that in terms of the genetics. I've cited them in my book, but I can't go into it. Let's go into megalodon because I'm almost at the end of my time. And this is another great scientist, Catalina Pimiento from Colombia, from Bogota, who grew up during the time of the Colombian terrorist attacks. The kidnappings and the bombings were everywhere, but she kept her head low and she studied fossil shark's teeth. I believe she's the world expert on megalodon because she's the only person I know that's got 2 postgraduate degrees just on megalodon, a master's and a PhD. She's done some incredible work about their distribution, their nurseries, their lifespans, their average size of birth was about, let's see, what's a megalodon? 3.7 meters, something like that. The teeth are gigantic. This is not a big one. This is a fairly average sized megalodon tooth. This one's about inches, 5.5. The biggest ones are 18 centimeters or up to 7 inches in diagonal length. Average size of them, though, at their lifespan was about 12 meters. But the really biggest ones max out to maybe, we thought in the past, up to 20 meters, 22 meters or so. Many reconstructions of them are totally exaggerated, like this one made in America on the left. This one from the New Caledonia Museum is probably more accurate in terms of real size of the jaws. We used to think megalodon was like a big gnarly white shark on steroids, but recently a paper was published, Stearns et al. 2024, Pal Electronica, that showed it was more like a nurse shark with a very long, slender body. How do we know this? There's actually a skeleton of megalodon in a museum in Belgium, 144 calcified vertebrae. And previously, where the tail began was misinterpreted. We now know the tail was much longer compared to the overall axial skeleton. The scales of this shark indicate it was more like a nurse shark than a white shark. So a big predator, but slow moving, but still capable of obviously taking down whales. We know that because we found megalodon teeth stuck inside whale vertebrae. Did you know megalodons have saved more human lives than they've ever taken? There's a section in the book where I talk about the archaeology of megalodons, where back in the Middle Ages, the medieval times, I should say, in Italy and parts of Europe, people were frightened of being poisoned to death by their enemies. So they made these beautiful silver Natterzungens, that's the German word for them, means adder's tongues, with shark's teeth with silver clamps around them. And before they would toast their friends or potential enemies, they would dip their wine glasses into the shark's teeth and look very carefully, because if the clasps on those teeth turned dark color, they suspected it might have been poisoned by arsenic. And there's an element of truth to this, because a scientific paper was written saying that arsenic does react from the silver clasp to certain poisons and would have stained and turned a darker color. Oldest shark attack victim we know of is this skeleton from Japan, dated 3,000 years old. He survived. Obviously, he lost his leg and his hand, but he lived to old age, was buried in a ceremonial cemetery. So it's quite a great account of how people live with sharks and still got attacked by them in the early days. All right, to finish off, here's some images of white sharks I took. When I got the contract to write this book, I foolishly told my agent and my editor that I would go cage diving with white sharks so I could write about it. And I got to do that a couple of years ago off the Neptune Islands, and it was an absolutely life-changing time for me to see these sharks up close, to observe them, how they're all different, how they all have their battle scars. Absolutely awesome. And here's a little video of me in the cage, what it's like. There's the shark right there. It's fantastic. This is sustainable ecotourism. These are tuna baits. They're not allowed to chum the water with animal blood or guts or whatever. And the sharks aren't allowed to get the bait. They just lure them towards the boat and take the bait away. So there's no interaction between the boat and the shark apart from the smell of a potential bait. White sharks are threatened by many things today. They're either on the endangered species list because of the way the waterways are being changed by humans and their food resources are changing, but they're also being eaten by orcas. There's a number of cases in Australia, South Africa, and off the California coast where orcas have grabbed white sharks, turned them upside down, they go catatonic, and then they squeeze out their livers to eat them. When this happens, by the way, the white sharks disappear and they don't come back for up to 6 months to those same feeding grounds. So they have to find food elsewhere. And finally, sharks are under threat today. A third of all species of sharks are endangered or threatened. The main problem is overfishing or bycatch, where big commercial fishing trawlers will catch the commercial fishes they want, but they'll also take in many thousands of tons of sharks that shouldn't be in the nets and they die, unfortunately. There's massive pollution in the oceans as well, not just ghost nets and things that might trap sharks like this mako shark, but also the microplastics increasingly abundant in all marine life. We don't know the full extent of how it affects their livelihood, but we do know with invertebrates that filter feed, like oysters and shells, that it's causing a decline in fertility in those species. And of course, there's climate change. Climate change is mainly wiping out sharks because it's wiping out reefs, more importantly. But small sharks like epaulet sharks have a Page's temperature of 24 to 28. That's a temperature where reproductive fitness declines rapidly. And we know from experiments done in aquaria that certain temperatures will suddenly affect their fitness to reproduce. And there's also, finally, many species are protected, but there's simply no regulation of those laws to protect them, like this poor dagonose shark from Brazil, the coati, which is almost extinct and no one's stopping it going extinct, even though they could if they really wanted to. I think the future hope, there's not much hope on a positive scale unless ecotourism really picks up. Canadian studies have shown that the value of sharks for tourism will actually overtake the value of sharks for food in less than 20 years, because all around the world now, there's shark ecotourism to the point where they're creating new marine reserves to protect the sharks that actually bring in more dollars as tourist attractions than they do as food. I talk a lot about that in the book. Finally, we've just learnt that some sharks, like the Greenland shark, can live for potentially up to 500 years. This was published in Science only recently, the last couple of years. They don't even reach puberty to 150 years. It's a long time to wait for your whiskers. But basically, there's a lot we can learn from sharks. Sharks have survived all 5 mass extinction events. And in the end of the book, I summarize a little essay on the wisdom of sharks and what we can all learn from them as humans in terms of survival and living sustainably. So I hope you get a chance to have a look at that. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
So I'll take Chairman's privilege and ask you a couple of questions. So you mentioned finding shark fossils in coal.
Yeah.
Is that does that mean that coal was forming in seawater, or were the sharks in freshwater?
Basically, the coal forms in estuarine or lake environments, but there are cyclothems that all the coal deposits in North America and Europe. Cyclothems are cycles of a marine incursion after the coal has been buried, like swampy coals in fresh water and then a marine incursion. So the sharks come in and then you've got the next, it's changing sea levels, causing like up to 50 different pulses in a short time, or a few tens of thousands of years. But you do get the sharks in those marine incursions that come in, but you also get some of them in the actual coal swamps, which are like the xenocants, which were freshwater dwellers. So you get them in both. Yeah.
And you didn't mention whale sharks. So where did they come along?
The oldest whale sharks are known from teeth that go back 40, 50 million years. But whale sharks belong to the Erectolobiform group or the Wobbegong group. So they're not related to white sharks or whaler sharks. They're a complete gigantic form of wobbegong, basically. They've even got the little lobes. They're reduced, but wobbegongs have tassels coming off their mouth. They've even got remnant little tassels on their mouth. Yeah.
Could you say something about the evolution of bone and cartilage and how it might stop the two going back to the audio fishing?
Yeah.
And why would sharks have gone from bone back to cartilage? Presumably it's softer, and yet they're much bigger.
Well, some cartilage is softer. Cartilage comes in many different forms. So the shark cartilage, globular calcified cartilage, is a special kind of cartilage that no other creature has. That's incredibly strong, but also light. So they evolved their own kind of cartilage to create their own kind of skeleton. But they started off, like all vertebrates, having dermal bone, but not endochondral bone like we have. So our entire skeleton, we have dermal bone, of course, in the head and you know, remnants in our fingernails and things, but most of our skeleton, we start with a cartilage cord, then ossifies. So it's called endochondral bone. Sharks have never ever evolved endochondral bone. It's a bony fish vertebrate lineage thing. It's all in the book. I mean, I could talk about bone and evolution of cartilage, but in a nutshell, they evolved their own special kind of cartilage, and that's really the success story of sharks. Yeah. Yeah.
I read somewhere that human teeth evolved from the scales of early sharks. Is that?
Well, we're not human teeth. Human teeth evolved from ape teeth, but mammalian, well, vertebrate teeth, the first vertebrate teeth you get in fish that has enamel, proper enamel, dentine, bony base. They could have evolved from shark's teeth, but no one's ever proven that theory. There's an inside out and an outside in hypothesis because there's also dermal denticles evolving in the throat of early Osteichthyans that could have been the beginning of teeth. So there's two contrasting views. I talk about it in the book because the placoderms, these ancient early jawed fish, had the first true teeth of any vertebrate. And that's only been recently proven through synchrotron scanning of their tissues. So it's a lot more complicated than you think. It's not just a scale evolves into the mouth as a tooth. They could have also gone from the inside to the outer part of the mouth, or they could have come from placoderm dermal bones that had elaborate ornament that then evolved onto jawed bones. So I talk about all these hypotheses in more detail and give you the references in the book. The book, by the way, is fully referenced with about 400 references cited in the back, so you can chase up all the science aspects if you wish.
You mentioned that you could find sharks if you're walking your dog in Bear's Den.
Yeah.
I know that the Yarra is its colour because it flows through Silurian mudstone, and you
Yes.
mentioned Silurian rock.
Yeah.
So can we spot sharks in the cuttings of the Eastern
Unfortunately
Freeway?
not. It's really deep water, the Melbourne Trough. So you get graptolites, these little floating invertebrate colonies, and you get submarine shells. But sharks at that time are incredibly rare, and they're mostly found in shallow water deposits. So I think it's the wrong environment for them. I have looked.
You mentioned that early on there were sharks in freshwater and
Yep.
so on. Why are they not so prominent in freshwater now, given their evolutionary survival?
That's a really good question. We don't know. We know that a handful of sharks, especially bull sharks, can go a long way in freshwater. They have the osmotic ability to process the difference between the saline water and the fresh water. And saw sharks can do this, or saw fishes, which are a group of rays. There's far more species of rays that can do it than sharks. So maybe the rays are just better adapted. Some sharks have rectal glands that can actually secrete the salt into the urea. They have a way of dealing with it differently from other creatures. So don't know. That's a very, very good question, but there's no real clear answer to why. Yeah.
Up the back there?
It's one of the group of proto sharks that were found mating, that you were able to tell that the male was the male because they're claspers.
Yep.
They actually developed claspers.
Yeah. I published it in 4 papers in Nature, actually, in 2008. The placoderms were the first vertebrates to have claspers, reproductive organs on the males and missing on the females. And we know this because we actually found the embryo inside a mother fish, which I named Martopissus attenborough eye after Sir David Attenborough. So that's the oldest embryo of a vertebrate ever recorded. from the Devonian 380 million years ago. So then it set us looking at all these different groups of jawed placoderms, and we found other embryos and other kinds of claspers developed. And the whole evolution of claspers from sharks to placoderms, it was probably the other way around, from placoderms to sharks, is that these claspers developed as orthologs of limbs, like the same genetic process that develops limbs, paired limbs, developed paired claspers in placoderms. And these were all separate. But by the time you get to sharks, the claspers are part of the pelvic girdle or the hind fins. And the sequence is really well documented. So we wrote a big review of it in Biology Reviews 2015, and a big paper looking at all the reproductive pelvic structures in these placoderms to look at that sequence.